You haven't finished. You have more work to do. And they're like, what are you talking about? You have to finish it, because if you don't, you then have to pay them a lot of money. Hey, what's up, guys? So I've got a hell of a story to tell you today. There was a post on Reddit recently that's getting some traction where a game developer emerged sharing his experience with a publisher that destroyed not only his game launch, but also his game dev studio, turning his game dev dream into a nightmare. If you're a game developer, you need to be aware of this situation. And I want to thank the developer for having the courage to post this. This is a very bold move, and it's useful and insightful for the rest of us in the community so we don't fall into the same trap. So I'm going to read to you this post, and I'll add some of my comments and opinions throughout. And let me just say that anything I say in this video is not fact, but my opinion based on the inferences in the supplied post. This is going to be a hell of a story, so put your seatbelt on. There's nothing easy about creating a game. You can learn every programming language, master every physics engine, and download every asset in your genre, and you haven't even scratched the surface. Designing, writing, testing, marketing, advertising, selling, releasing, and patching a game require a broad set of skills. Too broad for most people. Sure, you can get the rare gem created by insanely gifted individuals, such as Minecraft, Braid, or Undertale. But more often than not, the game's ultimate vision requires more hands and minds. So you set up a team. You assign roles and responsibilities. You forge partnerships. And suddenly you aren't a bright-eyed loner with a dream. You're running an entire company. You know, when people start in the game development space, they can be quite naive. I know I've went through that phase myself, where we get this notion that we can do everything ourselves. And we look at some of those flagship hits like Minecraft or Undertale, and we think, well, if they can do it, we can too. And while that is true, those examples are the edge cases. They are not the norm. For every one of those surprise hits that gets released, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of games which kind of go under the radar, fall into mediocrity, or outright fail. The story I'm about to tell you is one of gaming failure, and the reason that I'm telling the story is to help the next generation of game developers. If they can even avoid one of the misjudgments or miscalculations that I made when Dapper Penguin Studios was creating Recipe for Disaster, everyone in the gaming community will benefit. Part 1. In the beginning, there was Rise of Industry. It was May 2019, and Dapper Penguin Studios was riding high. Our new game, Rise of Industry, was an indie gaming hit. 500,000 wonderful gamers chose to buy the game and support our efforts. The game ended up grossing over 3 million euros, even after expenses. And after the substantial cut that our publisher takes, there would still be plenty in the war chest to work on the next title. We would all have jobs for the next years or so, at least. So we created and released a big expansion pack called Rise of Industry 2130. The great reviews started coming in, even better than the original title. This resulted in more sales, and thus more momentum. We were happy. Our publisher at the time, Calypso, was happy. It was time for the next challenge. Part 2. Doubling down on a loss is failure defined. To understand how things went so wrong, we need to pause our narrative very briefly. If you want to understand what's about to happen in our story and what was going on in the minds of the decision makers, including myself, we need to talk about human nature and something called the martingale betting system. Vigorously flip a perfectly balanced coin under ideal conditions, placing a bet on heads. You have a 50-50 shot of being right. If you lose, don't worry, you can always make a new bet and flip again. In a martingale system, this philosophy is taken to the extreme. Every time you lose the coin flip, you have to double down. So if you lose a $10 bet, your next bet has to be $20, then $40, then $80, then $160, and so on. The theory behind martingale systems is that nobody could be that unlucky. Who loses 5, 6, or 7 coin flips in a row? This, of course, is a complete fallacy. Nobody has an infinite bankroll. Big losing streaks happen, and nobody has enough money to take advantage of the martingale system in any meaningful way. Now imagine that every game development process is a coin spinning in midair. Of course, quality and process matter as far as the odds for success, but particularly for an indie studio, there are plenty of ways to get blindsided. Unexpected competition in your game genre, bad release timing, sudden trend shifts as far as subject matter, and even global pandemics can impact the results of a dev and release cycle. Nothing is ever a sure thing. And that is so true of the game dev market. You can do all the right things, tick all the boxes, game design, art direction, marketing beats, everything looks right. But then one little thing can undo it all and the train can come off the tracks. Releasing on the wrong day with a competing title or something else. There's so many ways it can fall apart. And I've seen plenty of games that should have done well. Objectively they looked good, everything seemed right, but for whatever reason, they didn't. And often it's to do with release timing and things like this. Now that you understand the mindset, and now that you see the trap, you're ready to read about how it all went wrong. Part 3. A true recipe for disaster. There was a minor change on the publishing side. Something that shouldn't have made much of a difference to us as long as business continued as usual. In November 2019, Calypso Media Group spun off a wholly owned subsidiary named Kasedo. They were supposed to be specialists in digital-only launches, particularly on the PC side. In late 2019, I presented 3 different pitches to Kasedo, allowing them to choose which one would be the best based on their market knowledge. They settled for the restaurant sim. We wanted to get into early access within 6 to 9 months. This was supposed to be a small, high-quality game that would continue to build our reputation and bankroll. Instead, it would take 2 years before Recipe for Disaster would even see early access. And even then, the timing wouldn't be ideal, as we'll get into soon enough. Some of the reasons for the delay are probably obvious to most readers. Our development cycle coincided with the rise of a global pandemic. But there were additional factors at play, including one that I had partial control of: feature scope. Given what was going on all around the world, I had the option to immediately cut back on some of the release features. We would need to deliver what was promised to Kasedo contractually, of course, but every other feature would be put on the chopping block. I didn't do that. In the end, the 2020 development cycle didn't cut out as many features as it should have. We had a vision for the game, and despite circumstances, we were planning to stick with it. That vision involved things like multiplayer. We all felt that putting out a high-quality game, one that would be reviewed and received well, and had a lot of positive word of mouth, was key to the future of Dapper Penguin Studios. It's never easy to cut features because you feel like you're cutting the lifeblood of the project. But we get caught up in those abstractions. It's kind of like an onion. You start with an onion and you slowly peel away the skin until you get to the core game loop. And for game developers, the idea of releasing a product that's kind of underwhelming or doesn't reflect, our vision can be quite petrifying and, debilitating at times. But we have to move beyond that. That's the nature of the process. Our publisher wasn't helping matters. We had been locked into a bad deal where they were going to take a large percentage of sales and contribute absolutely nothing towards development costs. This is highly unusual. One would think that because they made 7 figures off our previous game, Rise of Industry, that they would offer to help out during this crisis. Instead, their demands piled up as if everything was business as usual. Everyone was working insane amounts of overtime. There were mental and physical breakdowns. But behind the scenes, hidden from most of our employees, upper management was dealing with an additional hardship. Recipe for Disaster was rapidly bankrupting us. Man, this is getting heavy. And big props to the developer for writing this post and revealing this kind of information. This is the kind of stuff that is privileged information that you won't find out about unless you're firsthand involved. So yeah. Part 4. Heartache by the numbers. I cannot stress this enough. For anyone aspiring to get into game development, this section is perhaps the most important thing you need to consider before embarking on a new project. Understanding where all the money goes during a development cycle is vital if you want to have any chance at success. Some of these figures will only apply to small or medium-sized studios. Other numbers will apply even if you're running a solo project, depending on your publication strategy. In this business, everyone gets cut. Whether you do it yourself or have outside help, you're going to need ways to advertise your game, distribute it, and communicate it with customers in an organized way so that you can release patches and offer sequels or DLCs. On the distribution side, Steam takes a 30% cut, which has become an industry norm. You need to pay taxes appropriate to your country, lump in license fees, patents, trademarks. For the moment, let's assume the break-even scenario in a country that only charges taxes on profits. The publisher's cut will depend on how they're involved specifically. Most contracts will have them taking a more significant percentage in exchange for helping to pay for the development, issuing in advance against royalties as certain milestones are achieved. In a development assist contract, the publisher typically takes between 30 and 40% of the gross. There are tons of factors that might change the actual percentage, ranging from the royalty recapture rate, often 100% until it's paid off, to IP and merchandising rights. So this is another one of those areas that often gets overlooked by people who are entering the game space. You know, they assume that everyone is rich and making a lot of money. They look at the Steam numbers, but they forget that there's so many people that are taking money from the creators. You know, Steam gets a 30% cut. Publishers, if you're using one, get a 30 or even 40% cut. So what are you left with at that point? You're left with 20 or 30%, you know, something like that. So you are holding the smallest piece of the pie when all is said and done, and you created the game. That's how it goes, right? You know, and it's not so dissimilar to the music industry or other creative disciplines. Even if you have a publisher that's helping to pay for development, if for any reason you go over budget before you reach a milestone, all development costs come out of pocket. That means you need to be quite specific with the contract when it comes to milestones and publisher required changes. It should be clear that anything outside of the normal delivery requirements is to be developed at the publisher's expense. Otherwise, your small development company can be bled dry. You also need to be specific about activity reporting. If something isn't recorded, reported, or demonstrated in the right way, the publisher might refuse to release the next tranche of development money. Similarly, the publisher needs to have full transparency when it comes to how they're actually earning their percentage, subject to evidence of ad spend, commitments from influencers and reviewers. If activity reporting and auditing don't go both ways, somebody is going to get fleeced. With that in mind, let's run the numbers in a perfect world. Let's say you have a 9-month development cycle that costs £250,000. You hit all your benchmarks and your publisher releases the development money on time. Let's say your retail price is £15. £4.5 of each sale is taken off the top by Steam or whichever platform you're using. That means each sale that isn't returned is 10.5 towards your £250,000 advance. So 23,810 sales need to happen before the advance is paid off. After that, each sale is split between the publisher and developer. Let's say a 65-35 split has been negotiated. That's £6.82 for the developer and £3.68 for the publisher. That's assuming you have a clean, uncomplicated development cycle. Recipe for disaster wasn't either of those things. In our case, the initial 2-year development cycle cost approximately £600,000. So a large amount of money moving around, a lot of legal entanglement. And it's quite interesting what happens when you kind of exceed that small indie category and move to the upper echelon of the indie tier. And it's quite a wide range that you can operate in and still be called indie, you know, studios of 10, 15 people. But you know, you can see how complicated it gets. Without getting into specifics that cannot be disclosed at this time, we did not have a standard development contract as depicted above. That means Dapper Penguin Studios and ultimately myself was on the hook for the complete development cost. This is not normal. It might be something to do if you're working with an elite publisher company that has a lot of clout. But as we're about to discuss, that didn't turn out to be the case with Cassetto. By late 2020, it was clear that the cost of the development cycle wasn't viable anymore, but our contractual obligations meant that if we didn't deliver, we would have to cover Cassetto's costs, which they estimated to be an additional £200,000. We had no immediate way to challenge that estimate, and time was of the essence. Our options were to fold the studio and end up owing a massive sum of money with no hope of making any of it back, or pull some desperate maneuver to self-fund the balance of dev until release. Imagine being in the middle of a game development cycle and looking at the numbers and realizing that It's just not feasible anymore. But because you're contractually obligated to the publisher, you have to finish it. Because if you don't, you then have to pay them $200,000 or euros or pounds or whatever, a lot of money. This is where the martingale effect kicked in. The logical move would have been to cut my losses, cut the studio's losses, and explain the whole unfortunate situation to my team. The war chest from our previous game's profits might get completely drained, but we wouldn't take on any additional debt or risk. We could continue to collect residual from our 2 released titles, even though those were dramatically slowing down. Instead, I doubled down. In 2021, I mortgaged my house. This raised £150,000 to keep the debt wolves at bay. It would buy us a couple more months towards milestones and the release date. Dapper Penguin's coffers would be completely drained, and I'd be in a massive amount of personal debt. But my team would still have jobs, and there would be a glimmer of hope on the horizon. This really pains me, this situation. To have to mortgage your house and put everything on the line, put your whole life into chaos, your family, your kids potentially, just so you can keep the lights on at your studio, keep your team employed, and meet your contractual obligations to your publisher. Oh man. Ultimately, it wasn't enough, however. That summer, Cassetto offered to buy the rights to our previous game, Rise of Industry, for a pittance. My refusal was answered by asking for more and more features in our current game, Recipe for Disaster. Trying to accommodate these requests pushed back release even further and led to an even more dire situation within Dapper Penguin. I felt like I was being manipulated by my own publisher, so I'd be forced to sell our existing intellectual property. This was another crossroads where I could have shut it all down and walked away. This time it was pretty late in the development process, so there would be more lawyers involved. It was a nightmare scenario. So I doubled down again. I begrudgingly sold the IP for Rise of Industry. It was a final, desperate attempt to keep people employed throughout 2021. The source code, art, music, sequel rights, everything was transferred to Cassetto in exchange for the 5-figure amount that we needed to keep the lights on through Christmas of 2021. That's the financial reality of the situation. But it was a situation that could have been mitigated somewhat if pure cold logic had been applied to the situation early on. But that would have meant firing people in the middle of a worsening pandemic. Just about the most heartless thing I could think of. Still, maybe that would have been better than a far broader downsizing that eventually happened in January of 2022. When faced with the prospect of releasing a far more simple game, putting the studio's reputation at risk and throwing the lives of several team members into chaos, I chose the emotional path instead of the financially sound path. I stuck to my guns. I doubled down. Hope can be one hell of a drug. It makes you do whatever you need to do in order to flip that coin just one more time. Surely it will come up heads this time. Surely everything will work out in the end. Eventually we had to win. But as I explained, that's not how numbers work. And that's not how the real world works either. Business and emotions. Now that's an interesting tussle. Do you go the emotional route and help your employees out? Or do you keep your business from going bankrupt? Cold hard truth says you keep the business from going bankrupt because the only reason the employees are there are to prop up that business. The business is the entity. But it's hard, right? Because, when there's people involved, human nature and emotions, it's very difficult to make those decisions. And it's why some of the most successful businessmen in the world are very cold and calculated because that's how they get ahead. They don't make emotional decisions. They look at the numbers and they make decisions on those alone. Part 5. Failure defined by the clauses of a contract. When someone tells you to read the fine print, it's often used to comic effect. But when you're signing a business contract, it isn't the fine print that gets you. It's the sea of normal sized print. When it's your company and your dream on the line, you should never sign an agreement before a qualified lawyer who is exclusively on your side reviews the terms. Their ability to boil down that wall of text into vital terms is invaluable. Their ability to envision both the typical and the worst case scenarios and codify what happens in each case is well worth any comparatively minor cost that you will pay. What might be missed if a qualified industry-specific lawyer doesn't review the contract first? Let's start with auditing. Let's say our studio wanted to make sure that Cassetto was living up to their contractual obligations. In a fair, balanced, sane contract, we would be able to execute a standard auditing request and be provided with proof of work and effort. If Cassetto refuses to be audited, there would be real penalties and real means of assessing penalties and forcing compliance. Rejecting a notice to audit would be ludicrous under such circumstances. But that's exactly what happened in June of 2022. Our studio issued a request to audit the publisher on rise of industry sales figures, and it was flatly rejected. Of course, auditors and lawyers became involved when something like that happens. But with a more firm contract that automatically issues penalties for a refused periodic audit, things likely wouldn't have gone as far as they did. Part of the auditing process on both sides should be the right to record evidence. Otherwise, any party could promise anything they want, and there would be no penalty or possibility to enter such a conversation into evidence. But in Q4 of 2021, a senior Cassetto representative refused to allow us to record video calls. This meant that auditing what was said or what was promised during such calls became impossible. The only choice at that point was to restrict communication to formats with a paper trail, such as email. Limiting the ways in which you can communicate with your own publisher in order to secure a proper audit trail is less than ideal, as you might imagine. So first, the publisher refuses to be audited, refuses to reveal their numbers, all the figures related to the developer's project, and then they refuse to be recorded, so there's no trail of what was said. Why would you have an issue with that, right? And then to be forced to only communicate with them via email, because that's the only way you have a record of what was said. Because imagine, you're in a video conference and they're just saying whatever they want, making all these promises and stuff and not living up to any of them. And then you tell a legal team, well, they said all these things. And they say, where's the evidence? Where is it? And then only being able to talk with them through email, to not have that kind of interpersonal, face-to-face conversation where you can see people's body language and face and kind of determine if they're deceiving you or, if they're, how they truly feel about something. Whenever one side of a contract takes action that significantly increases the risks for the other party, there needs to be compensation. There was none in this case. This is yet another reason why getting a lawyer to review a contract before you sign is critical. Vague phrases can be made more well-defined. This helps not only the auditing process, but what defines a completed benchmark or a finished game. So that's an important point there. You need to contractually write down what the game looks like in its finished form. Because imagine you finish the game and you say to the publisher, here's the game, I finished it. And they look at the game and say, no, you haven't finished, you have more work to do. And they're like, what are you talking about? We've done all the work. They're like, no, you have to do all this other stuff. And they keep pushing you forward and forward and forward and forward indefinitely. So you need to define those boundaries of what are we even making? What is the product here? Part 6, results matter. One would think, given they were taking a massive percentage of gross sales and offering zero development funding, that Cassetto would produce results. Our games directly under Calypso sold fairly well after all, and Cassetto is supposed to be the specialists for digitally released games. Instead, they scheduled the early access for Recipe for Disaster right into several competing titles, including the release of Forza 5. We were completely lost in the chaos. In the same month, they released the DLC for their City of Gangsters release simultaneously with the biggest competitor, Empire of Sin. It was like they chose to do no research whatsoever. When our studio called them out on this comedy of errors, we were reprimanded for questioning their competence. Imagine paying what you believe is a specialist to do your marketing, and then they schedule dates for you. You look at the dates and you're like, well, that has a clear conflict with another game, or this date is clearly not suitable for a launch. And then you say to them, like, what's the deal? Like, why did you schedule it on that day? You're a specialist, right? How could you not see that was an issue? And then they come back, oh, how dare you question our, knowledge and... Oh, man. Eventually, Recipe for Disaster got noticed by the algorithm. Opening sales were brisk, but there was one repeated request from our customers: introduce a free play mode. Cassetto had previously held several playtests and conducted many surveys. There were supposedly polls, focus groups, and internal discussions. None of Cassetto's feedback included any mention of free play as being a desirable feature. All of our focus had been on the original game mode and arc, and now our skeleton crew would have to scramble to get this new feature added. Their handling of negative reviews was robotic, almost comical. Rather than addressing the specific concerns of a Steam reviewer, their general line was, "We're working on patches and hope you give the game another try soon." Yeah, that's a problem, because on Steam, when you get negative reviews, you can actually get them to turn around. I've seen developers who communicate with the bad review and say, look, they speak plainly as a developer, say, look, I've done my best here. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. And if you like it, then, consider changing your review. And I've seen people go from negative reviews to positive reviews because of that kind of liaison. But if you just have this kind of candid, robotic responses, you're not going to get any of that. Reporting of sales during early access was irregular and chaotic. It should be a simple matter. Share the Steam statistics weekly, and pull together any additional numbers we need to be aware of from time to time. Instead, I was begging for numbers in May of 2022 because we'd seen no updated sales figures for over a month. Why would this not be automatic? What kind of preparation or manipulation needed to be done before we saw the sales figures exactly? And this is a big thing that a lot of indies don't realize when they get into an arrangement partnership with a publisher. You don't typically get access to the stats. Your own game is locked off from you. So instead of you logging into your dashboard on Steam and seeing all your financial statistics, no. You have to ask the publisher to give that to you. So that information is relayed through them. So you can imagine if you had a bad publisher or a dubious publisher, what could take place during that point where they're relaying it to you. They could change the numbers. They could give you falsified screenshots and informations. They could completely undercut you. And that's a really big consideration to make. If you want to have control of that data, if you want to have direct access to your own financial reporting, then maybe going with a publisher is not for you. In July, the comedy of errors continued. A trailer was cut that used vague language and was missing features. The most requested feature of free play, the one we busted our humps to make a reality, wasn't even mentioned by name. We had to micromanage the editing to include the details that players wanted to see. The same month, our studio was pressured to add the Epic Games Launcher SDK, only to find out that the platform was going to be closed when we planned to release it. Then August rolled around. It was supposed to be a celebration of the game's exiting early access and achieving its 1.0 release. This was a big moment for us. On full release, we should have been able to benefit from a sales surge once all of the promised influencers and review sites got a hold of the game. But that never happened. Recipe for Disaster's Twitter account had about 400 followers. Only 2 of the 10 promised media sites reviewed the game in the first week. Smaller sites broke the embargo and released their reviews early. The total follower count for the dozens of influencers that Cassetto had been collecting was under 2 million. It was a fiasco. So that's something to keep in mind. Just because a streamer or influencer says they're going to promote your game on launch, if you haven't paid them, don't hold them to that. They can fall through on launch unless there's money on the table. If there's money on the table, they'll do it. But if you want that kind of organic streamer content, it's hard to get because they have a lot of endorsements, they have a lot of paid opportunities. So for them to kind of clear their schedule and make a stream for you for free is not always tenable for them. The biggest slap in the face was that the publisher, Cassetto's Twitter account itself, rather than announce our game, Recipe for Disaster, and pin the tweet for all to see, they kept up a previously pinned tweet about another game, Ixion. A game they actually had funded and had real stakes in. They didn't even care to pin the announcement of their newest game. Those of us left at Dapper Penguin Studios were stunned. Our publisher was shooting themselves in the foot and hitting us with the ambulance on the way out. The end result of all of this? 3k to 10k euros a month of income, which is sure to slow down as time goes on given the publisher's efforts to date. My hopes of hiring the full team back, which cost 25,000 to 40,000 euros a month, is simply impossible. Well, that kind of sucks. You've released a new game and your own publisher is not even promoting your game on their Twitter. Instead, they're still promoting a previous game they published that they had actually invested in. And I guess that's the difference between when somebody has a financial stake in something and when they don't. So you almost need your publisher to have a financial stake in your game. If you want them to care, if you want them to truly care, they need to be invested somehow financially. But for that to happen, then you need to give them a bigger cut typically, and then you have to pay them off for that advancement. So there's a trade-off here. It's not so straightforward. Part 7, caveat emptor. Caveat emptor means let the buyer beware. I allowed optimism and prior success to blind me to the things that could go wrong when one gets into bed with the wrong publisher. That tunnel vision cost all of us at Dapper Penguin Studios dearly. When I signed on with Cassetto, I was taking a massive risk. They were asking for more and giving us less than any of their competitors. In exchange, we expected intensive contracts, professional competency, and a healthy amount of industry guidance on the audience testing, advertising, and platform release side. Instead, we experienced a level of underperformance and ignorance that can't fully be expressed here. They often scolded us for bringing up valid statistics and critiques when it came to Cassetto's staff and practices. There would be no escalation, and Calypso had no intention of providing any form of mediation or real oversight. We were incredibly lucky that our previous game, Rise of Industry, basically sold itself, and Cassetto knew that as well, given the tactics they used to acquire the rights to it. Over the past few months, they had milked the Rise of Industry franchise dry, putting it on sale after sale, bundle after bundle. It was a quick cash grab for them, nothing more. That hurts me almost as much as their treatment of our new game Recipe for Disaster. Almost. So what a difficult and horrible situation to be in as a game developer. You're giving away such a huge amount of your profit to a publisher to do all these things that seemingly are not being done. And imagine that. Imagine the publisher buying your previously successful game and then putting it on sale after sale and just kind of milking it dry. But they're well within their rights to do so, of course. The developer did sell them the IP. That was their choice. So, what the publisher does with that IP after that is nobody's business. They have complete rights to it. It's theirs. So when our luck ran out and Cassetto was faced with a game that required more explanation, a finer tuned demographic, and actual marketing talent, the train went off the tracks quickly. But that hardly mattered to them because they weren't helping to pay for development. They had no skin in the game. That meant that if this game was too hard for them to market, they could just find another sucker who would accept a split somewhere between 30 and 40% with no financial contribution. Lather, rinse, repeat. It will only be a matter of time before the next young developer comes along, starstruck and eager to sign on the dotted line before they realize that they've given away a third of their profits for nothing but promises. That's certainly a thing where some developer who is very passionate about their project will be contacted by a publisher who says, wow, we love your game. Would you be interested in letting us publish you? And you think, oh yeah, man, they love my game. This is awesome. But you don't realize that this publisher probably wrote that email to like 100 other developers casting a really wide net. And sometimes these publishers even have a brand appeal and you think, oh wow. But you got to realize you're signing away a huge portion of your game and you're not necessarily going to get the promises that you've been told. So you have to do due diligence and, kind of decide very carefully if you go through that door. There are already a lot of lessons learned included here, but let me end with one final one. Buyer beware, particularly if you're talking about taking on a partner who refuses to put their money where their mouth is. Otherwise, you just become part of their numbers game, a lottery ticket that they never paid for. Consider this a cautionary tale and be careful out there. Wow, what an absolutely epic write-up. First of all, kudos to the developer for putting such time into eloquently conveying that information. It's so insightful and so valuable. We don't necessarily know the full picture. This is one particular facet, one account. It's very subjective, obviously, but there is a broader picture that we don't necessarily know. So it's always good to put that out there, okay? But let what has transpired here be a warning to you if you're looking for a publisher. Not all publishers are the same. Not all of them are as skilled as they should be for the job they're claiming to do. And you're giving away such a huge amount of your total sales revenue. So yeah, due diligence, look into publishers, have a look at their backlog, get in contact with developers who have worked with them and see what they have to say about it. So drop a comment down below. What do you think about this situation? Do you have similar situations with publishers, or has it all been smooth sailing? And generally, what you think about publishers as a whole and their place in the current indie dev landscape. Thanks for watching, guys. Please do drop a video a like. It was very taxing for me. I went through 3 bottles of water. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the read, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do drop a like. And thanks to all my Patreon supporters. I appreciate you guys so much.